On the very first day, Lebanon's army tried to actually implement a brand new peace framework. Negotiated for months and signed at the U.S. State Department, Israeli troops opened fire, not at Hezbollah. At the Lebanese armed forces themselves, the exact institution this entire plan was designed to empower. On Tuesday, July 21st, 2026, Lebanese army units deploying into the southern town of Zawtar al-Gharbiyeh, following an Israeli withdrawal that had only just begun, came under fire from Israeli forces. Israel's military confirmed it happened, calling it warning shots fired into the air. Lebanon's military called it something else, an incident that could directly undermine the very plan both governments had just agreed to. Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened on the ground in Zawtar al-Gharbiyeh, what this new framework agreement was actually supposed to accomplish, why this specific incident is being treated as such an early, serious test of the entire process, and why the timing. On the same day, Lebanon's president sat down with President Trump in Washington, makes this moment even more significant. Stay to the end, because this isn't just a border skirmish. It's the first real stress test of a peace deal that's only weeks old. Let's start with exactly what this new framework agreement actually is, because you need to understand the plan before you can understand why this specific incident matters so much. Late last month, in June 2026, Israel and Lebanon signed what's being called the Tripartite Framework Agreement, negotiated and formalized at the U.S. State Department in Washington. The core structure of the deal is fairly straightforward on paper. Israeli forces would begin a phased withdrawal from designated areas inside southern Lebanon, while the Lebanese armed forces would simultaneously move in and assume full security responsibility for those same areas, including the specific task of confiscating weapons from the Iran-aligned Hezbollah movement in the territory being handed over. According to reporting, a U.S. official described the establishment of these initial handover areas, known as pilot zones, as representing real, tangible progress on the ground toward a lasting peace, with the expectation that a successful first phase would build the kind of confidence and momentum needed to keep expanding the process into additional areas over time. To oversee and manage exactly this kind of transition, the Framework Agreement also established a joint monitoring body back in June called the Military Coordination Group for Lebanon, a tripartite committee made up of representatives from the United States, Israel, and Lebanon, specifically tasked with coordinating and troubleshooting these handovers as they happen. Now let's walk through exactly what happened on the ground this week, because the sequence of events matters. According to reporting, Israel's military announced on Monday, July 20th, that this pilot zone program had officially begun. The very next day, Tuesday, July 21st, Lebanese army troops started deploying into the southern town of Zawtar al-Gharbiyeh, moving in specifically after Israeli forces had withdrawn from that area, exactly as the framework agreement called for. That's where things went wrong. According to the Israeli military's own account, Lebanese army personnel, accompanied by an engineering vehicle, crossed roughly 150 meters into what Israel considers its designated security zone, near the neighboring town of Zawtar al-Sharqiyeh, and in doing so, breached physical barriers that had been set up along the boundary line. Israel characterized this movement as contrary to the specific understandings that had been agreed between the two parties. In response, Israeli soldiers operating in the area fired weapons, an incident the Israeli military quickly moved to characterize very specifically and very carefully. Here's the exact language the Israeli military used to describe what happened, because the precision of this specific wording matters, given how serious the underlying accusation could otherwise sound. According to an official statement from the Israel Defense Forces, soldiers operating in the area fired warning shots into the air only, explicitly stating that the gunfire did not endanger Lebanese armed forces personnel, and that the purpose was simply to distance them from the area rather than to harm anyone. That's a carefully worded statement, drawing a clear distinction between firing warning shots as a deterrent measure and firing directly at Lebanese soldiers with intent to cause casualties. No casualties were reported from the incident on either side, a detail worth noting immediately, since the physical outcome of this specific exchange was far less severe than the political and diplomatic alarm it triggered almost instantly afterward. Let's talk about how Lebanon's own military characterized the same incident, because their framing was considerably more alarmed than Israel's careful, minimizing language. A Lebanese military statement confirmed that army units came under fire while carrying out a deployment operation in the town, and specifically warned that the incident could hinder the implementation of deployment steps in the pilot zones currently being carried out through coordination with that same tripartite military coordination group established just weeks earlier. That's a significant warning from Lebanon's own armed forces, an institution that has, throughout years of complicated, tense relations with Israel, generally tried to maintain a fairly measured professional public tone, even amid repeated Israeli strikes and incursions. When Lebanon's own military explicitly states that an incident could hinder the entire framework's implementation, that's not routine diplomatic boilerplate. That's a direct public acknowledgement from the Lebanese side that this specific episode has genuinely rattled confidence in a peace process that had only just gotten underway. Let's zoom out and understand why this particular incident carries so much more weight than it might if it had happened during a period of ordinary ongoing hostilities. This wasn't a random skirmish during active combat. This happened during the very first practical test of a brand new, carefully negotiated framework, specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of confrontation from happening. The entire logic behind establishing pilot zones, phased withdrawals, and a dedicated tripartite monitoring committee was to create a structured, predictable process where Israeli withdrawal and Lebanese army deployment could happen in careful coordination without the kind of confusion, miscommunication, or accidental confrontation that has repeatedly derailed previous ceasefire arrangements between these two countries. The fact that Israeli forces opened fire, even warning shots fired into the air, during the very first deployment under this very first pilot zone, suggests the coordination mechanisms this framework was specifically built around may not be functioning as smoothly as officials on both sides had hoped when they signed the agreement just weeks earlier in Washington. Let's put this into the broader context of just how fragile Israel-Lebanon ceasefire arrangements have proven to be throughout the past 2 years. Because this pattern didn't start with this new framework agreement. Going back to November 2024, Israel and Lebanon signed an earlier ceasefire agreement mediated by the United States and France, intended to permanently end that year's Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the broader Israel-Hezbollah conflict. That earlier agreement didn't hold particularly well. By January 2026, Israel had reportedly been accused of more than 2,000 separate ceasefire violations under that specific arrangement, with those violations allegedly killing at least 15 people, including a Lebanese army officer along with several civilians. Israel, for its part, maintained throughout that period that its strikes were targeting Hezbollah fighters operating south of the Litani River, or responding to what it considered imminent threats against Israeli troops. That earlier ceasefire agreement was set to formally expire on March 2, 2026, and fighting between Israel and Hezbollah subsequently reignited into what's now being referred to as the 2026 Lebanon War, a renewed conflict that intensified sharply in March 2026, tied partly to wider regional tensions connected to that same period's Iran war. That renewed fighting proved devastating. By mid-April 2026, more than 2,000 people had been killed in Lebanon, and over 1 million people had been displaced from their homes. A new ceasefire was eventually reached on April 16, 2026, again brokered by the United States, but even that arrangement continued facing serious strain. Reporting from June 2026 documented at least 12 separate Israeli air raids and continual artillery shelling hitting southern Lebanon even after that specific ceasefire deadline had technically already taken effect, raising fears at the time that Israel might be deliberately working to undermine the broader diplomatic effort to end hostilities across the wider Middle East. That's the turbulent, repeatedly broken history sitting directly behind this new Tripartite Framework Agreement, signed in late June 2026. This isn't the first ceasefire these two countries have tried. It's arguably the third or fourth significant attempt at stabilizing this exact relationship within roughly a 2-year window, following a string of previous arrangements that each, in turn, eventually broke down under the weight of continued Israeli strikes. Hezbollah's refusal to fully disarm, and a persistent lack of durable trust between all the parties involved. Understanding that history helps explain why Tuesday's warning shot incident, even though it produced no casualties, generated such an immediate, alarmed response from Lebanon's military. They've watched previous ceasefire frameworks unravel before, and this specific warning about the pilot zone process being hindered reads very differently against that backdrop than it might in isolation. Let's talk about the diplomatic backdrop unfolding at the exact same moment this incident occurred, because the timing here is genuinely remarkable. On the very same day, Tuesday, July 21st, Lebanese President Joseph Aoun was in Washington, beginning direct talks with President Trump. That's not a coincidence in terms of broader diplomatic significance, even if the specific timing of the border incident itself was presumably unplanned. Aoun sitting down with Trump represents exactly the kind of high-level, sustained American engagement to this fragile peace process needs to survive its early, most vulnerable phase. And it means that news of Israeli forces firing on Lebanese troops during the plan's very first practical implementation reached Washington, and likely reached the negotiating room itself in near real time, adding immediate, unavoidable pressure to whatever conversation Aoun and Trump were actually having that day about the broader relationship between their two countries and Israel. There's also a broader regional backdrop worth understanding, because this specific Lebanon incident isn't happening in a vacuum separate from everything else unfolding across the Middle and East during the same window. According to reporting from the same days surrounding this incident, the United States was simultaneously dealing with an active, escalating conflict with Iran, including reported American casualties, and retaliatory Iranian strikes against U.S.-linked targets across multiple Gulf states. That means the Tripartite Framework Agreement in Lebanon is being tested at precisely the moment American diplomatic and military bandwidth is being pulled hard in an entirely different direction, toward an active, high-intensity confrontation with Iran. Whether that broader regional pressure makes Washington more or less able to respond forcefully to a relatively contained incident like Tuesday's warning shots in southern Lebanon is a genuinely open question, one that officials working the Lebanon file are almost certainly weighing carefully as they decide how to respond. Let's talk about the specific strategic stakes riding on whether this new pilot zone program actually succeeds, because the consequences of failure here extend well beyond just this one town. According to reporting, Israeli officials have voiced real skepticism about whether Lebanon's own army genuinely has the capability to fully disarm Hezbollah in the areas it's taking control of, even while Israel simultaneously treats this broader deal as what officials described as a vital step toward building longer-term peace between the two countries. That's a notable tension sitting at the very heart of this entire framework. Israel wants the Lebanese army to succeed in this handover process, because a stable, disarmed southern Lebanon under full Lebanese armed forces control is precisely the outcome Israel has been seeking for years. But Israel's own skepticism about Lebanon's actual capacity to deliver that outcome appears to have translated, at least in this specific instance, into an extremely low tolerance for anything that looks even slightly like an unauthorized Lebanese military movement, even a movement of just 150 meters, involving an engineering vehicle rather than combat forces. That 150-meter detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it illustrates just how tightly controlled and sensitive this entire pilot zone process actually is in practice. This wasn't a large-scale Lebanese military maneuver or a significant, deliberate incursion into contested territory. According to Israel's own account, it was a relatively modest movement, roughly 150 meters, involving personnel and a single engineering vehicle, crossing what Israel considers its designated security boundary near Zawtar al-Gharbiyeh. That such a limited movement was enough to trigger Israeli forces firing weapons, even warning shots specifically aimed to avoid casualties, tells you just how narrow the margin for error currently is within this new framework. If a movement of this scale can produce gunfire on day one of the pilot zone program, that raises serious, legitimate questions about how the broader, more ambitious phases of this plan, involving larger-scale Lebanese army deployments across wider stretches of southern Lebanon, are actually going to unfold without triggering even more serious confrontations down the road. Let's also think through what happens next procedurally, because this incident didn't just happen in a vacuum without any formal follow-up mechanism. According to reporting, the U.S. mechanism, referring to that same tripartite military coordination group established under the Framework Agreement, was formally informed of the incident, exactly the kind of structured, coordinated response the entire monitoring body was designed to provide. That's actually a meaningful, if easy to overlook, positive signal buried inside an otherwise alarming story. The framework's dispute resolution mechanism appears to have functioned largely as intended, at least in the sense that both sides quickly reported the incident through the agreed formal channel, rather than the situation spiraling into an uncontrolled, escalating exchange of fire or competing public accusations with no clear process for de-escalation. Whether that formal reporting mechanism actually produces a meaningful resolution, adjustments to the security zone boundaries, clearer coordination protocols for future deployments, or some other concrete outcome, is exactly the kind of detail worth watching closely in the days following this specific incident. Let's be honest about what remains uncertain here too, because a story this fresh inevitably comes with real limits on what's currently confirmed. We don't yet know whether this specific incident will be treated by both governments as an isolated, quickly resolved miscommunication, or whether it represents the first sign of a much deeper breakdown in coordination that could threaten the broader pilot zone program going forward. We don't know exactly how President Aoun's conversation with Trump in Washington that same day addressed, if at all, this specific incident happening back in Lebanon in real time. And we don't yet know whether Lebanese army deployments into additional pilot zones beyond Zawtar al-Gharbiyeh will proceed on the original planned timeline, or whether this incident causes officials on either side to slow down, renegotiate specific boundary lines, or add additional coordination safeguards before continuing the broader rollout. Let's add some important context about Hezbollah's own position throughout this entire process, because the group at the center of this disarmament effort hasn't simply stood by quietly while Israel and Lebanon's government negotiate its fate. Hezbollah has faced mounting pressure, both domestically from within Lebanon's own political system and internationally from the United States and other Western governments, to give up its remaining weapons arsenal entirely. But Hezbollah officials have repeatedly stated that they won't fully disarm until Israel stops its airstrikes on Lebanese territory and withdraws completely from several points it has continued occupying along the border in southern Lebanon. That creates a genuinely difficult chicken and egg problem sitting underneath this entire pilot zone framework. The plan requires the Lebanese army to move in and confiscate Hezbollah weapons in areas Israel withdraws from, But Hezbollah's own stated position is that it won't cooperate with disarmament until Israeli strikes stop and Israeli forces withdraw from remaining occupied points, exactly the kind of withdrawal this pilot zone program is supposed to gradually deliver. Incidents like Tuesday's warning shots, even when relatively minor in physical outcome, risk reinforcing Hezbollah's argument that Israel isn't actually committed to full, good faith withdrawal, potentially hardening the group's resistance to disarmament rather than encouraging it. It's also worth understanding just how severe the fighting got before this latest framework agreement was reached, because that recent history explains why trust between all sides remains so fragile. On April 8, 2026, shortly after a ceasefire had been announced for the broader Iran war and Hezbollah had signaled it would pause its own attacks on Israel in line with that ceasefire, Israel launched what it described as its most powerful attacks yet on Lebanon, killing at least 357 people according to reported figures, with Israel claiming roughly 250 of those killed were militants. That single wave of strikes, arriving just as Hezbollah appeared to be standing down in coordination with the broader regional ceasefire, represents exactly the kind of jarring, trust-destroying escalation that's defined this relationship over the past 2 years. When you understand that just over 3 months before this week's warning shot incident, Israel had launched its most powerful attack on Lebanon specifically at a moment when Hezbollah believed a broader ceasefire was taking hold, it becomes much easier to understand why Lebanese officials react with such immediate alarm to any new incident involving Israeli forces firing weapons near their own troops, even when that specific incident is described by Israel as nothing more than a controlled warning shot. Before wrapping up, it's worth being clear about where the details in this video actually come from, since this story broke within just the past several hours as of this recording. The core details of Tuesday's incident, the 150-meter breach, the warning shots fired into the air, and the confirmation that no casualties occurred, are drawn directly from Reuters reporting, corroborated by the Israel Defense Force's own official statement as reported by CBS News, and Middle East Monitor's coverage citing Anadolu Agency and Israel's public broadcaster, Kan. The broader historical context on previous ceasefire violations and the April 2026 escalation comes from Wikipedia's continuously updated entries on the 2024 and 2026 Israel-Lebanon ceasefire agreements, cross-referenced against contemporaneous Al Jazeera and PBS NewsHour reporting from those respective periods. Given that this is an actively developing story, with President Aoun's talks with Trump still ongoing in Washington as of this recording, it's worth checking for updated reporting on how both governments formally responded to this specific incident if you're watching this anytime after today. There's one more institutional layer worth understanding before we close out, because this pilot zone framework doesn't exist in isolation from the other international mechanisms that have long operated along this same border. The United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, known as UNIFIL, has maintained a peacekeeping presence along the Israel-Lebanon border for decades, monitoring exactly this kind of boundary line and reporting on violations from both sides. UNIFIL's continued presence adds another layer of international scrutiny and reporting to whatever happens next in Zawtar al-Gharbiyeh and the other pilot zones still awaiting Lebanese army deployment. Meaning this week's incident isn't only being assessed through the lens of the brand new Tripartite Framework and its military coordination group, but also through the lens of a much older, more established international monitoring apparatus that's been tracking Israel-Lebanon border tensions since long before this latest round of negotiations even began. How these overlapping monitoring mechanisms, the new U.S. Israel-Lebanon Coordination Group and the older UN peacekeeping structure, interact and reinforce each other going forward may end up shaping whether incidents like this one get resolved quickly and quietly, or whether they become recurring flashpoints that slowly erode confidence in the broader peace process, one warning shot at a time. Let's go back to where we started. On the very first day, Lebanon's army attempted to put a brand new, carefully negotiated peace framework into actual practice, deploying into a town its own government had just regained security responsibility for. Israeli soldiers opened fire. Warning shots, according to Israel, an incident that could hinder the entire process, according to Lebanon. No casualties, but a genuine test of trust delivered on day one in front of a Lebanese president who was, at that exact moment, sitting across from the President of the United States, trying to secure the kind of sustained American backing this fragile process desperately needs to survive. This new Tripartite Framework Agreement was built specifically to avoid the chaos and mistrust that doomed the ceasefire arrangements that came before it. Whether Tuesday's incident in Zawtar al-Gharbiyeh becomes a minor, quickly resolved footnote in that process, or the first visible crack in a peace deal that's barely a month old, is a question that both Washington and Beirut are almost certainly asking themselves right now. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly why a single incident of warning shots carries this much weight, make sure to like the video and drop a comment letting us know what stood out most, whether it's the 150-meter breach that triggered the response, the timing alongside President Aoun's meeting with Trump, or the long, troubled history of previous Israel-Lebanon ceasefires that came before this one. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking whether this new pilot zone framework actually holds together in the weeks ahead, because based on the pattern of every previous Israel-Lebanon ceasefire attempt, the next test is very likely already on its way.